Welcome everyone to this evening's presentation, which is in partnership between the East Hampton Library and the Hamptons Observatory. Tonight, we're proud to present Terry Garcia, author of The Future of Exploration. And before we begin, just a little bit about Terry. Terry Garcia was Executive Vice President and Chief Science and Exploration Officer for the National Geographic Society for 17 years. He was responsible for the Society's core programs, which included more than 400 scientific field research, conservation, and exploration projects annually. Under his leadership, the Society's programs experienced significant growth in both global impact and prominence. And prior to joining National Geographic, Terry was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmospheres for the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And he served on NOAA's General Counsel from 1994 to 1996. And without further ado, I'd like to turn over this evening's talk to Terry Garcia.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to do tonight, well, obviously talk about the book, and tell you about the reasons that I wanted to write this book or undertook this project. And I should say that the book is a compilation of 38 essays that have been written by some of the top scientists and explorers out there, as well as some equally impressive early career, mid-career scientists and explorers, all people that I've worked with. And, you know, the reasons for writing the book are all a product of my experience as the Chief Science and Exploration Officer running the National Geographic's exploration enterprise. And I'll just say up front that I won the job lottery, that being the Chief Science and Exploration Officer was, I mean, it was like no other job on the planet. And I also tell people that I feel that I was fortunate to have occupied that position during what I consider to have been the golden age of the institution. And it was an incredibly exciting time to be there. It seemed as though, a bit of an exaggeration, but it seemed as though every month we were announcing a new discovery or the launch of a new initiative. And one of the reasons was I wanted to share the excitement of exploration with the reader. And in particular, you know, one of the most exciting moments of all, that's the moment of discovery, when all the effort, all the waiting, all the angst is suddenly behind you, and you're about to see the product of your labor, as it was here, standing in a cramped subterranean vault in Kabul in 2004, waiting to see if the Bactrian gold treasure, which had been compared to Tutankhamun's treasure, had somehow miraculously survived decades of war and conflict. Or here, one very cold November evening in the Hall of 500 at the Palazzo Vecchia in Florence, as we inserted a tiny little camera to take a look behind the wall to see if Leonardo da Vinci's masterpiece, which had not been seen in more than 500 years, was still there. And you know, I had the privilege of working with extraordinary people, and so I also wanted to, you know, give readers a sense of who these individuals are, these scientists, these explorers, and, you know, what is it that drives them? Why do they do what they do? So when I was at Geographic, every year we had something called the Explorer Symposium, and we'd bring together very promising early career scientists and explorers, as well as our more established grantees and explorers. And, they'd exchange ideas, project ideas. There would be conversations with the staff. And from time to time, we would invite a celebrity to come in and close the week-long event on the Friday. And so one year we invited this guy, Reggie Watts, comedian, and he spent the entire week with us, meeting with the explorers, talking to the staff, gathering stories and material for his routine that he was going to do at the end of the week. And so on Friday, he's up there going through his shtick, and he's talking about, some of the interesting personalities that he's met. And then he gets on the mission of National Geographic, and he begins to riff on that. And, the mission statement is in that kind of stilted 19th century language to increase and diffuse geographic knowledge. And he said, that wasn't the original mission statement. That the original mission statement was when Gil Grosvenor and a colleague were out in the field, and Gil pointed in some direction and said, "Hey, what's that over there?" So the crowd thought that was very funny. You had to be there. But he, I think, had a point. And that is that there does seem to be baked into, at least some of us, this need to see what's on the other side of the hill, or, what's just beyond the horizon. But the book asks, is it really as simple as that? Is exploration, as some have said, merely curiosity acted upon? And I'm not sure it would explain this person, Wasfia Nesreen. She is a climber. She's summited the 7 highest mountains in the world, but she's used her platform and has essentially risked everything to advocate for women's rights in Bangladesh. She's Bangladeshi, as well as for recognition of the true heroes of Everest, the Sherpa. And it doesn't explain why somebody would walk 1,500 miles for almost 2 years through one of the densest forests on the planet. Nor can it adequately explain why somebody would go on a crash diet so that they could squeeze through a tiny little opening in a subterranean cave, knowing that they might not be able to get back out. And it certainly doesn't explain why someone would endure having their eyeballs freeze while they're climbing Everest, which is what happened to Jim Whittaker, the mountaineer. And he said that having his eyeballs freeze wasn't the worst part, that the truly worst part was when they began to thaw, that the pain was indescribable. So the evolutionary anthropologist, Svante Pabo, who won a Nobel recently, has said that no other mammal moves around like we do, that there's a kind of madness to it. Well, it's perhaps not madness, but perhaps genetic or biological. And there's some scientists who actually believe that this urge to explore is actually encoded in our genes. And they've identified a gene which they call the restless gene that's carried by about 20% of the population. And according to the theory, if you have this gene, if you're part of that population of 20%, you're more inclined to take risks. You're more inclined to experience new things, new ideas, new places, to generally embrace movement and change. Whatever it is, the drive to explore, to push oneself to the very limits of human endurance is very, very powerful in some individuals, as many of the essays in the book illustrate. And this is a case in point. This is Eric Weinmayer. He is a world-class climber, and he's also blind. And I'm just going to read you a little passage from his essay, and it's about crossing the icefall at Everest. And he says, sometimes, and remember he's blind, sometimes the crevasses were so wide I couldn't feel the other side with my trekking poles. The only way across was a literal leap of faith. the members of my climbing team would tap their poles on the opposite bank where they wanted me to land, and then I'd jump. So these people are not wired like most people. And if I had to describe the personality of an explorer, I'd say they're all very determined, very focused, obsessed, if not crazed, optimistic, some to the point of delusion, and they're all quite incredibly brave. So one of the essays says that the greatest discovery of the 20th century was the magnitude of our ignorance. And that leads to a third reason for the book. And it's really the central thesis for the book. And that is that the 21st century is going to be the greatest age of exploration in the history of humankind. You know, that despite the fact that, you know, we can hop on a plane and travel to just about any point on the planet, there's still surprises out there. There's still mysteries. There are even some blank spaces left on the map. And in large measure, this new age of exploration is being driven by advances in technology, technologies that are giving us the keys to unlock these mysteries, to open doors we thought were permanently closed to us, and in some cases, revealing doors we didn't even know existed. It's things like ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, high-resolution satellite imagery, which, by the way, this is of Egypt, and it shows an archaeological site where a cemetery has encroached upon the archaeological site, as well as you can see these pits that have been dug by looters. LIDAR, a phenomenal technology that's now being applied particularly to archaeology, and a new generation of remotely operated deep sea vehicles. All of these technologies are revolutionizing the way we explore and the fields, the scientific fields that are involved in that exploration. And so a good example is an essay by archaeologist Chris Fisher. And Chris tells the story of the search for the city of the monkey god and how LIDAR technology revealed something that hadn't been seen in perhaps 1,000 years. Now, for those of you who don't know the story, I'll just give you a quick summary. For centuries, there were rumors that there was this place in the dense tropical forest of Honduras where there was a city that was made entirely of white stone, and its inhabitants had worshipped a monkey god. And it was first heard about by Cortez, and he told the King of Spain that he had it on good authority that there was this place where the riches exceeded those in Mexico, and that the towns and villages were as large as those in Mexico. There were contemporaneous accounts with his that said there was this place where people ate off of gold plates, which of course the Spaniards loved gold. And even stories about a place where the native peoples had retreated from the Spanish invaders. Well, Cortez looked for it, never found it, and over the centuries, a number of people have searched for it, and they were equally unsuccessful. And then in 1940, this fellow, Theodore Mord, who was an adventurer, explorer, diplomat, some said spy, journalist, was hired by the Museum of the American Indian to lead an expedition into Honduras. He went in, and about 4 months later, Mord emerged from the forest, and he claimed that he had found the city of the monkey god. And he told this fantastic tale about this great walled city that had a massive pyramid, and there was a stairway on the pyramid that led to a dais, and on the dais sat the monkey god himself. And he returned with with artifacts to prove that he had been there. And he went around the country telling this story, but he wouldn't reveal the location. He said he was going to go back, but he wouldn't tell anybody where it was. And a couple of years into his travels, he committed suicide. And so the secret died with him. Now, there's some people who think he just completely fabricated the story. But whatever he did, the secret died with him, and the trail seemed to have grown cold until an explorer and filmmaker by the name of Steve Elkins commissioned a LiDAR survey over an area where it was suspected if this place had ever existed in any form or manner, that it was probably located there. And the survey indicated one particular area that appeared to have been worked extensively by human activity. So Steve and Chris Fisher, the archaeologist, a National Geographic photographer, Dave Yoder, and a team of specialists went in, and the purpose was to ground truth the results of the LiDAR. And they found the remains of a 2.5 square kilometer city, evidence of buildings and pyramids, and in a clearing, just fantastic, hundreds of these stone objects that were half buried in the ground, with intricate carvings of spirit animals, of things like a weird jaguar, vultures and snakes. And so now they returned from Honduras and they reported the findings. And of course, I had to go and see it for myself. Couldn't pass this one up. And so with Chris Fisher and some colleagues, we decided that we were going to return to Honduras. Chris warned us that this was a particularly unpleasant place. In fact, I think the way he described it was that it's the most hostile forest on the planet. And he put particular emphasis on the venomous snakes that were there, and they were everywhere. Coral snakes, jumping vipers, something called a fer-de-lance. Its nickname is the ultimate viper, very aggressive and territorial, one bite, and if you don't get treatment within an hour or so, you're dead. There was also this alphabet soup of tropical diseases, everything from malaria to dengue fever and lots of other unpleasant things. I wasn't worried about the diseases, but I was laser focused on snakes. Wanted nothing to do with the fer-de-lance. And so I made sure we had all sorts of equipment to guard against that, including anti-venom for the fer-de-lance. And we went to Honduras. With the aid of the Honduran military, they helicoptered us in. And I should say that was probably the riskiest thing that we did, because the helicopters they were using were Vietnam era helicopters, and they hadn't been maintained quite up to standards. Maybe they'd been maintained since the Vietnam War era, but I'm not quite sure about that. And we had some issues, which I won't get into right now. But we made it in. We made it to the site. We hiked in. It was as spectacular as we had anticipated. No incidents with any snakes. Made it back to Washington. And it was there that I discovered that my concern about snakes was perhaps misplaced. In fact, it was misplaced. That what we should have been concerned about was this tiny little fly, this sand fly that came out at dusk and is buzzing all around. And it carries a parasite that causes the disease leishmaniasis, which can be deadly. And at the very least, it causes horrible disfigurement. And the only treatment is a really intensive course of chemotherapy. And half the team contracted this disease. We had to send them to NIH for treatment. And the remarkable thing was that this treatment, by the way, is really bad news. You almost feel that the treatment's worse than the disease. But when they were finished, they all returned to the site to excavate the site. Again, the personality of an explorer. So another example of technology leading to a major find, in this case, satellite technology, is Lee Berger's story. And Lee is a paleoanthropologist. He is based out of Johannesburg. And I've worked with him for many years. He's a really enthusiastic guy, great guy. Well, one October evening, I received a call from Lee late at night, and he was excited. He was actually just, you could tell, vibrating on the other end of the phone. And he said, "Terry, if you're ever going to believe in me, you have to believe in me now." And he proceeded to tell me what he had found. And at the end of it, I agreed that we would provide him with a grant, and worked with him for many years, in for a pound, or in for a penny, in for a pound, and off he went. But the background to this story is what I want to tell you about. So a couple of years prior to that call, Lee had made a discovery of a stunningly intact hominin fossil, Australopithecus sediba. It's about 2 million years old. And he proceeded to excavate the site. And it was a major find. He had to halt excavation so that a canopy could be built over the site to protect it from the elements. And that meant that Lee had nothing to do. So he's sitting around, he's twiddling his thumbs. He decides he's going to go back and he's going to review some of his earlier research. And part of that research had been reviewing high-resolution satellite images of an area that's just outside of Johannesburg called the Cradle of Humankind. And from that imagery, he'd identified these limestone outcroppings, 10 of them. And the outcroppings indicated cave systems. And it was in those cave systems that Lee thought he might find fossils. So he sent two of his friends, two of his buddies, two cavers, Steve and Rick, out to investigate these 10 caves. They went to the first 9, nothing. They came back empty-handed. They had saved the last one, which was the Rising Star Cave system. And it was last because they figured it was least likely to produce anything because it had been used by cavers over the years. And presumably, if something was there, someone would have found it and reported it. But they decided they were going to be diligent, and so they went into to the Rising Star system and went through a series of narrow passageways, and finally squeezed through the one last fissure. And they were in a very pitch black chamber, which they believed was the end of the path. And so now I want you to just imagine for a moment that you're there with Steve and Rick, and they're kind of wandering around. You can only see with the light on your helmet. And one of them points to the floor and goes, there's a hole over there. And they go over and they take a look at it. And Rick says, "Well, it's pretty small. It's 19 centimeters, about 7.5 inches wide." And Steve is going, "Oh, that's not very wide. Maybe I could fit through that, but we can't see what's on the bottom here. Is the floor 50 feet, 100 feet?" And at that point, Rick goes, "Well, I think we should do it." And Steve goes, "Yeah, great idea." And so he goes down they call it a chimney chute, and makes it through. And fortunately for him, as Lee describes him, Steve's a human toothpick. So he makes it down, climbs down about 40 feet to the another chamber. It's about the size of a walk-in closet. And he begins to survey the area and move out of that chamber. And there he finds everywhere on the floor is bone. It turns out that over the next several years, Lee and his team will have discovered the largest assemblage of hominid fossils ever found anywhere. And it's an entirely new species that Lee names Homo naledi. Now, Lee and his team think that Homo naledi, which by the way was a very, very, very distant relative on the human family tree. It was about 4 feet tall, had a brain the size of a chimpanzee. And Lee and his team believe that Homo naledi was actually disposing of its dead in this cave system because there are hundreds down there. Now, Lee had to, as you can imagine, the really narrow passageway, he had to recruit archaeologists and paleoanthropologists who could fit through these openings. So a bunch of skinny scientists. And it's driving him nuts. He wants to be down there badly. And he goes on a crash diet, loses a ton of weight, and somehow, I don't know how, but he somehow shoehorns himself into that chimney chute, makes it down into the chamber. He almost doesn't make it back, by the way. But while he's down there, he discovers what he believes is evidence that Homo naledi used fire and made these markings on the wall. Again, remembering that these are only very, very distant relatives of ours, not modern humans, and they're doing something that we thought only a few of our species could do. So the book also asks the question of, provocative question of, in some cases, should we explore? And you may be asking who this guy is. This is the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he's credited with developing the ethical principle of ought implies can. Basically, you only have an ethical obligation to take action if you can actually perform that act. And so the ethicist Simon Longstaff, who wrote an essay for the book, basically in his essay, inverts the Kant maxim to ask the question, does can imply ought? Just because we have the technology, just because we know how to do it, should we? And an example of that is this, de-extinction. Scientists for years have been working on how we might be able to bring back an extinct species if we have access to its genetic material. And there's a prominent scientist, or geneticist rather, at Harvard, who has formed a company with the express purpose of bringing back this animal, the Tasmanian tiger. The last one, by the way, died in captivity in the 1930s. And his company also says that it's looking at the possibility of bringing back a woolly mammoth. And so Simon asked the question, well, if you could successfully bring back one of these species, these extinct species, how would it survive in a changed environment? How many would you bring back? What are the consequences of doing so? What are the potential unintended consequences? He's not saying don't take a particular action, but he is saying there are a set of questions and ethical principles that before we go out and undertake these activities, we should examine. And one of the reasons that I wanted to have his essay in this book is that when I was appointed to President Obama's commission to investigate the explosion of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig. And in interviewing the engineers, one of the things that kept coming up was this idea that we could build it, but we couldn't fix it. We had the ability to do something quite remarkable. It was an engineering feat akin to putting someone on the moon, and that is in ultra deep water to drill down and hit a spot precisely miles down in the ocean. But the problem was, although we could do that, if something went wrong, we didn't have the ability to respond in a timely and effective manner. And that's something that is perhaps characteristic of many new technologies. So the book advocates that let's step back, ask the questions before we proceed. The book also has a number of early career, mid-career scientists who are going to be the next leaders. They will be assuming the leadership roles from their predecessors, and they look at exploration in a very different way. They argue that exploration today is no longer about finding new lands or territories, but rather it's finding solutions to global challenges. And they also call for opening up the field, that there is a need for new and diverse perspectives, that looking at the world through a single lens is far too limiting, as well as calling for the removal of a number of the barriers that are still in place and limit entry. This is one of those explorers, Katie Croft Bell. She's an ocean explorer. And she makes the point in her essay that in addition to what we'll discover, we also need to keep in mind who will be doing the exploring. And that right now, the richest nations, the richest institutions control exploration of the ocean. And she's working to create a suite of low-cost distributed tools to support a community, a global community of explorers, so that we can accelerate our understanding of the planet. This is Paula Kahumba. She's a wildlife ecologist in Kenya, and she opens her essay by saying that exploration has always looked different from an African perspective, that what was new and exotic for the European explorers was familiar and already well understood by Africans. And she argues that, yeah, our worldview needs to be informed by Western science, but it also needs to be informed by traditional knowledge. And finally, there's this gentleman, Dr. Sammy Ramsey. He's a world-class expert on honeybees. And he talks about barriers, among other things, in his essay, and overcoming perceptions. And in his essay, he says that, I'll just quote him, "I was asked to leave my PhD program, not on the basis of any failure to meet a standard, but because I was told that something about me just didn't seem like doctoral material." Fortunately for us, although he had to leave that PhD program, he went to Maryland and received his PhD there. So the oceanographer, Sylvia Earle, has often said that the first step in changing the world is knowing, and that with knowledge comes caring, and that with caring comes action. And many of the essays in the book examine this notion of exploration with purpose. And for me, the proof point, if you will, for that concept of how exploration can change our view of the world, how it can inspire action, came fairly early in my career at National Geographic. And it was when a young conservation biologist by the name of Mike Fay came to us. He had this very audacious plan. He was going to conduct a transect, but it was a transect of an entire country. He was going to walk the length of Gabon, and he was going to survey and record everything that he encountered along the way. It would provide an extraordinary amount of scientific data, but it would require about 2 years of walking, which, you know, kind of crazy. But we were storytellers, and we thought, all right, well, that's going to make for a hell of a story. And so we put Mike out there along with a photographer, Nick Nichols. And Mike walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he walked some 1,500 miles for almost 2 years. You know, not since Livingston or Lewis and Clark has anyone done this. This was some of the most difficult terrain on the planet. And his purpose was to, you know, make these scientific observations, record them. But it was also, from Mike's perspective, a desperate last attempt to draw attention to what was happening. And along the way, he saw amazing things. He saw animals completely naive to humans. When he reached the coast, elephants and hippos were surfing in the waves in the Atlantic Ocean. But Mike had estimated that about 90% of that forest was going to be logged and lost. And his hope was that by doing this project that he could save maybe a tiny sliver of it and create a small reserve. And so when he completed the journey, he set out to tell the world about what he had seen. We did a story on him. We did a couple of television shows. put him out on the lecture circuit. And about a year into it, we got a call from the government of Gabon asking if Mike and Nick could come and meet with the president. And so we said, yeah, sure. We sent them off. They met with the president. In fact, they met with the entire cabinet. And Mike explained what he had observed and what he had found. They laid out all of the images. At one point, the president said, my gosh, I didn't know this was in my country. And at the end of it, at the end of the meeting, the president and the cabinet decided that they were going to set aside 10% of the entire land area of Gabon and create 11 national parks. And I tell the story because this was solely because of one individual, an obsessed individual, admittedly, and the power of the narrative and the images that he brought back. There's an essay in the book by Dr. Enrique Sala, and he was actually inspired by Mike. He came to me a couple of years after Mike's transect. We had called it the mega transect. And he was a tenured professor at Scripps. And he was explaining to me how frustrated he was. He said, all I do is I spend my time writing papers about the problems afflicting the ocean or reading papers by graduate students about these problems. He said, I don't want to write the obituary for the planet. We know what the problem is and we know what we need to do. And he told me that he wanted to replicate Mike's transect, except in the ocean. And that is go to some of the last truly wild places and survey and document them. And we figured, all right, this gentleman is willing to walk away from a tenured professorship. We, at the very least, should be willing to take a chance on him and give him a shot at pulling this off. And so brought him in, and out of that was born something called the Pristine Seas Initiative. And over the last several years, Enrique has led dozens of expeditions to some of the most remote places on the planet. And they've he and his team comprehensively surveyed and documented these places, recorded what was there, and then presented it to the authorities responsible for the governance of these areas. And by leveraging that information, and by the way, the media that is developed around or in association with the acquisition of that data, they have protected millions of square miles of ocean. This, by the way, is Millennium Atoll, which is in the southern tropical Pacific. Now, a final reason that I want to share with you is that many of the essays talk about the problems that we're confronting, and I wanted to at least communicate to readers that yes, there are lots of problems. There are difficult problems, but we do have the ability to respond to them. As one of the essays says, our greatest gift as a species is to choose the future that we want to see. And there's a thread that runs through most of the essays, if not all of them, that essentially says that we can solve the problems. It's just a question of will. And finally, I'll leave you with this. As we speak, there are men and women in some of the most remote and dangerous places on the planet, oftentimes enduring unimaginable hardships to expand our knowledge and to save what's truly important. And there are many more who are ready to go, who are willing to go, if only they had the means. And who knows what they might find? Who knows what we might learn? Who knows what we might save? And that's the reason that Chris, my co-author, and I agreed at the beginning of this process that we were not going to take any profits from the sale of the books, but rather whatever profits we could generate from the sale of the books would be used in the form of grants given to early career scientists, since they have the most difficult time raising funds. So buy books, buy lots of them so that we can help these scientists. Thank you very much. And now, Steve, happy to take questions if there are any.
Let's see what we have. Uh, we have one question from Barbara. Please spell out the name of the new species found. I think that was back when the slide with the extinct species, but there was one before that.
Uh, Australopithecus sediba.
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat in here.
Okay, you're really asking a lot for me to spell that. Let's see if I've got my. Oh, okay, here you go. Here you go. Here you go. Um, if this is the species she's talking about, it's Australopithecus, Australopithicus, and Sediba is Sediba. And as I say, that was a new hominid species that Lee found. Actually, his son stumbled across it when they were hiking.
Thank you. We have a question. Let's see. Donna asks, have you seen any similarities in the backgrounds or personalities of the explorers that you've known over time?
Yeah, they well, they're all very, very focused and determined. They're the most successful ones are single-minded in their pursuit, and that applies whether it's someone who is sort of the traditional explorer that you think of slogging through a tropical forest, but it also applies to those who are working in a lab, and it's that ability to maintain that focus despite setbacks that distinguishes them from others. And I'd also say that the other characteristic that they all have is they're optimistic. They're convinced. They're convinced that they're going to find whatever it is that they're looking for, and that also makes them. That also enables them to do what they do. If you weren't optimistic, I don't think you could put up with some of the hardships that these people have to put up with, and the low pay.
We have this is from Zoe. She says, "Thank you so much for doing everything. Your period with the NGS is when I got my subscription as a 10-year-old in 2003. And I grew up idolizing all of your explorers. The reason I majored in archaeology and work for the National Park Service today."
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. And as I said in the beginning of the presentation, it was an incredibly exciting time. And I feel very fortunate to have been there and to have been able to work with some of the most remarkable people on the planet.
Let's see. We have this is from Ed. How optimistic are you personally about the Earth's future?
I am optimistic. You have to be. I'm optimistic because, and this depends on whether you're a glass is half full person or a glass is half empty. But I'm optimistic because we really do know what we need to do. We know what the problems are, and we know what the solutions are. It's a question of will. Uh, do we have the will to do what needs to be done? Now, and depending upon your perspective, you may come to a different conclusion about being optimistic. But I am. I think we do have the ability, as one of the essayists says, to see the future and to want to change it. And I'm gonna stick with that.
Let's see. We have, what is your most memorable or meaningful adventure?
Ah. Well, there were a lot of them. But I'll tell you the story about the Bactrian gold, which is at the beginning of the presentation. That was a treasure that a Soviet archaeologist had actually found in the northern part of Afghanistan, an area called Bactria. And it's where Alexander the Great had swept through, and he basically stopped there. And it was also part of the Silk Road. So it had all of these influences of different cultures. And he found these graves of these royal nomads, and the graves contained 22,000 pieces of solid gold jewelry and precious stones. It was an amazing find. It really was like the Tutankhamun treasure. So he found this on the eve of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and he had time to catalog it, pack it up, and send it down to Kabul. And that was the last anybody saw of it until in 2003, 2004, one of the archaeologists, sort of the in-house archaeologist at National Geographic, Fred Hebert, came running into my office one day and said, I know where it is. I know where the Bactrian gold is. And we have to go to Afghanistan. And I said, Fred, we don't have to go to Afghanistan. You do. He said, no, you got to go with me. And so eventually he and I went. We camped out there. The the curators of the Afghan museum were very suspicious, and were not going to just let us waltz in, even if we're National Geographic. And so it took a while to gain their trust and convince them that our interest was one in providing assistance and conservation of artifacts, helping them catalog. And then we'd like to tell the story. We'd like to tell the world about what is there, so they understand the culture and the history. And eventually we did persuade them to let us have access, and we were down in that vault. They opened the safes, and there it was, every last piece. Now, that was not the reason it was the most meaningful project, or one of the most meaningful. Here's the reason. The only reason that treasure survived is that about half a dozen individuals, the curators of that museum, had decided that they were going to risk their lives in order to protect their cultural patrimony, that it was so important that they were willing to do that. And over decades, they did. They went to extreme lengths to hide this from first the Mujahideen and then the Taliban. And in fact, at one point during the U.S. invasion, the Taliban brought one of the curators down into the basement, into this vault, and ordered him to open the safe. And he had a key, and he put the key in and snapped it and broke it off. For whatever reason, the Taliban guy didn't kill him. But that was the real story. It wasn't so much that this magnificent treasure was there, but rather that these individuals had the courage to do something to ensure the survival of their cultural heritage. So I rank that as one of them. And there are lots more, and we don't have time to get into it. But I love talking about that.
Let's see. John says, wonderful presentation. Is the golden age of National Geographic over? If so, why did it end, and what is replacing it?
Well, it's a different age, and a different approach, I would say. We had during my years there, during my tenure, I had a particular idea or philosophy that we should use our assets and our resources as sort of a venture capital for science, that we would provide a lot of support to a lot of individuals, perhaps small grants, but we would seed the landscape with the understanding that many of these investments might not pay off, but some of them would pay off, and they'd pay off in a big way. That era, I think, is probably over, and there are other reasons for why I say that. The organization reorganized, and the media assets are now in a separate company controlled by Disney. The real power of National Geographic back then, before the reorganizations, was the combination of science and exploration with a very big megaphone, with the media platform that allowed us to take the results of that science, take the results of the exploration, and then communicate it to a broad public, a global public. And from time to time, because we did that, actually move the dial. There's just a different approach now. They're going for bigger grants, bigger projects, which is fine. It's just another philosophy that neither of us is right or wrong. It was just a different approach. So I think I'm going to leave it at that before I get myself into trouble.
Let's see. We have one attendee. Are there any opportunities you regret missing when you worked at the society? Projects that seemed too crazy or too big to work that actually in future really did?
Yep. So there are a couple of them. A couple of them I'm still working on. I haven't given up. There was one that I was just completely obsessed with for virtually the entire time I was at National Geographic. And that was to find basically the last iconic shipwreck out there. And that shipwreck was the Endurance, Ernest Shackleton's ship that sank in the Weddell Sea in 1915 in about 10,000 feet of water. And we knew exactly where it was, and had reviewed all of the logs, all of the diaries of the expedition crew, had assembled a team of experts, really the best in class, and put together several plans for going and finding the Endurance. I mean, it required, using icebreakers, using remotely operated submersibles. But we knew where it was. And like I say, it was in 10,000 feet of water. And our belief was that it was intact because there are no wood bores in Antarctic waters because there's no wood. And the enemy of wooden ships are wood bores. And so our belief was that, it was there sitting in a pristine state. Some of my colleagues did not think that was a good idea. In fact, I remember one of the memorable lines was, it's just frozen kindling, who cares? But I argued that, this is the greatest story of survival and adventure ever. And we have an opportunity to tell that story as well as use modern technology to find something. We never did. It was an incredibly expensive project, but a couple of years ago, somebody did in fact find it, and it was in pristine condition, just as I'd said it would be. And that really drove me crazy. So there was that one, but there's several others that we didn't get to that still looking at. One of them is in Egypt, and it involves Nefertiti. And so stay tuned for that.
We have, should some of the billions spent on space exploration be turned over to studying the Earth in an attempt to help save it?
Yeah. Yeah. I've always felt that way. When I was at NOAA, we always marveled and no disrespect intended, but always marveled at how NASA was so well funded and had this incredible publicity machine. And yet we were responsible for the marine environment, for ocean resources, the 70% of the planet. And so little was being invested in ocean exploration, and still is for that matter. So I believe in space exploration. I think we should invest in it, but I think we also have the resources to put into ocean exploration. because we have only explored maybe a percent of the deep waters. We don't know what we don't know. And when we do go out and send teams out there, we're constantly finding new species that we didn't know existed. You know, it's estimated that there are probably a million species. We've found about 200,000. So there's a lot we don't know and that we need to know. We need to understand the ocean chemistry, which we have changed, and we need to understand the processes because it's being impacted by climate change, and it's something that is essential to life on this planet. So I would hope that we would invest more money in ocean exploration and research.
Well, I'd like to thank you for this presentation, and I see there's a lot of other thanks for super talk, simply fascinating. Um, and we have a few other great, great, great accolades, and I'd like to thank you on behalf of the East Hampton Library, and I'd like to thank the Hamptons Observatory and everybody for being on this Zoom this evening. And we hope you have a wonderful evening and week ahead, and keep looking to those expeditions.
Yeah,
Definitely.
well, thank you very much. It was great being with you, and good evening to everyone, and keep exploring. And remember, buy that book so that we can support some scientists.
Thank you. Have a great
All
evening.
right, goodbye.